Okay, so continuing with the endocrine glands and the hormones that they release, we're going to start talking about the pancreas. The pancreas is in the abdominal cavity. Pretty much it sits deep to the stomach and small intestines as well. And the pancreas actually has two different components to it that are made up of totally different cells. So it has an endocrine portion, which of course makes hormones. The cells that are found in those structures are called pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans, which is actually a very small amount. The majority of the pancreas is the exocrine portion, which is made up of acinar cells. They have ducts that end up dumping into the small intestine. So we're going to talk about that part a lot more when we do digestive system. Okay, so the islets contain three main cell types. Alpha cells make glucagon, beta cells make insulin, and the delta cells make somatostatin, which remember we also call growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So showing the structure of the pancreas, the three components: it has a head, the body, and the very end portions, the tail. This is what it actually looks like in a light micrograph. We looked at this in lab. Okay, here it's just showing different colorations of the different cell types that are found here. I'm not going to have you identify or do anything from this part, but just to show that there are several different cells that each have a secretion that they're functioned to release. So glucagon and insulin regulate glucose or blood sugar levels. Glucagon is what we consider the starvation hormone. If you haven't eaten in a long time, your blood sugar is going to be low. Okay, so when that happens, alpha cells will release glucagon, and that's going to increase the amount of glucose that's in the blood. It does this by basically making your body release how we store glucose. We store glucose as glycogen in the liver and muscles, so we're going to promote the breakdown, which is glycogenolysis. Remember, lysis is breakdown. We're also going to form new glucose from potentially other sources like proteins or fatty acids in the liver. So that's gluconeogenesis. So it's going to break proteins of muscle, okay, to allow amino acids to be used. We've talked about this in other hormones for growth example as well. It's going to release the fats to also allow those to be converted to glucose. However, when you are forming these fuel molecules in the liver, it creates ketone bodies. Ketone bodies are carbon molecules because they come from fuel molecules, organic, which of course are carbon, that are formed when we are using fats to try to convert to glucose. And skeletal muscle cells and cardiac muscle cells are actually able to oxidize the ketone bodies, which basically allowing the ketone bodies to be used for fuel. When you are really limiting the amount of calories or you're starving yourself, glucagon will make a lot of ketone body formation. Unfortunately, it's too much, and the ketone bodies tend to accumulate in the blood, which is bad. And you can also have ketone bodies build up in type 1 diabetes mellitus. Why is it dangerous? Too much can actually lower the blood pH. Remember, we have that very narrow range for blood pH. And when it's caused, if you're decreasing the pH because of ketone bodies, we specifically call it ketoacidosis. So glucagon secretion is stopped when you increase the amount of blood glucose in the body, when you increase the amount of somatostatin or growth inhibiting hormone, or when you have insulin, which of course is the antagonistic hormone to glucagon. So what is the stimulus that makes glucagon be released? Anytime you have low amounts of blood sugar. When you're in the sympathetic nervous system, epinephrine primarily is going to want to increase the amount of glucose in blood. So you could release glucagon even if it's not particularly low because it knows the body is going to need to use this. And finally, if you're eating a protein without including it with the carbohydrate, that actually helps you to maintain stable glucose levels so they don't go really, really high, which typically occurs when you eat meals high in carbohydrates or rich in carbohydrates. So insulin, again, is the antagonistic hormone. So we say this is the feeding hormone because when you're eating, this is what's going to be released. So it's going to lower blood sugar. It's made by beta cells, and the target cells include liver, muscle cells, just like with glucagon, cardiac, muscle, skeletal, but also parts of the brain. So insulin is going to promote the uptake and storage of nutrients, primarily glucose. Okay, we're going to store as glycogen, but also if you have additional lipids and amino acids. We make glycogen and primarily store it in the liver and muscle cells. You can also store fats and carbohydrates additionally in the liver as well. And whenever you're releasing insulin, it binds to receptors in the brain that make you feel satisfied or fullness, and that's what satiety is. Hypoglycemia, remember hypo is too low, is a condition when blood glucose levels are too low. And this can be caused because you're taking too much insulin if you're being given it or your body's producing too much insulin. So if you have this going on, you're going to feel really weak, dizzy, you're going to be breathing really rapidly, you're going to feel sick, you're going to sweat because basically your body is not getting the fuel molecules that it needs to be able to operate properly. If hypoglycemia gets severe and blood glucose levels get very low, it can lead to confusion, hallucination, seizures, coma, and death. Basically, at that point, the brain is not getting enough glucose and it can't even communicate with other parts of the body. Hyperglycemia, of course, is when blood glucose levels are too high. So what can cause chronic hyperglycemia, which is going to be long-term, type 1 diabetes mellitus, which is insulin dependent, is also what we call that. This is when the immune system actually destroys beta cells, and beta cells make the insulin. So the target cells are unable to store glucose as glycogen for later, leaving more glucose in the blood. Glucose is overproduced in the liver because glucagon will elevate levels of ketone bodies when not enough insulin is present to counterbalance. So type 1 diabetes leads to glucose and ketones in the urine. You have too much glucose, so you're going to get rid of the extra, and then your liver has too many ketones as well. This draws water from your extracellular fluid because of osmosis, causing you to urinate much more often, polyuria, which basically means that you're going to be dehydrated. You're going to feel very thirsty. Anytime that you're releasing ADH, which is when you're dehydrated, you're going to feel thirsty because you want to add more water to the body. We call that polydipsia. Glucose and ketones act as osmotic diuretics. So remember, a diuretic increases urine production, taking the water off the body. But it does it to a point where it's not safe. So dependent type means a person has to be given insulin injections before they eat to help regulate blood sugar levels. Type 2 diabetes mellitus is non-insulin dependent. So in this case, it's not that the person is unable to produce insulin, it's that all of the receptors that are on the target cells for insulin are becoming desensitized. And so when insulin binds to them, it's not going to carry out the effects. So basically, the person has built up an insulin resistance because they consumed so many sugars that their body just is overwhelmed at this point. This will result in hyperglycemia. And you'll have signs and symptoms, glucosuria. So you're going to have more glucose in the blood. You're going to urinate more often. You're going to feel really thirsty. However, they do produce some insulin. Remember, it's just insensitive, so they don't have the extra ketones, so they at least don't have the ketoacidosis. Their blood pH can still be maintained. Type 2 diabetes is associated with heredity, so it can be passed from one individual to another, or obesity. Chronic hyperglycemia starts to have damaging effects on the body. Long-term, blood vessels, especially those in the heart and the lower limbs, aren't receiving enough blood to those tissues. So the heart's not getting proper oxygen. You can have a heart attack. Wounds aren't going to heal as well. You can actually have death of tissue to the point where limbs have to be amputated. Very common also, not even limbs, but toes or fingers, very peripheral tissues. Also peripheral nerves. The nerves start to break down, neuropathy. So you can have numbness and tingling. You lose sensation in the limbs as well. Other tissues that are affected, lens of the eye, capillaries of the retina, and the kidneys, basically they're not getting the glucose that they need, so they start breaking down. Blindness is expected. Eventually kidney failure if it's not fixed. So this is very serious. And of course you have the same symptoms in diabetes because a person does have chronic hyperglycemia if untreated. So again, insulin and glucagon have opposite effects. We have already talked through these components, the stimulus, the receptor, how the cells respond. So you can go through that for both insulin and glucagon. And then of course, this is just the diagram. Again, you can talk yourself through the differences and what those do. This of course is just focusing on insulin, which the stimulus is going to be when blood sugar is too high, when that one's going to be released. Okay, so the same thing for both, just review that. Again, this just puts some of the glands together. We've now finished talking about the pancreas. We still have to talk about the pineal gland and the thymus. Okay, so if you would like to watch this short video, feel free to do so. Would really like to discuss this in class. Okay, so we will talk about this in class to help review these areas. Okay, so some review questions to make sure that y'all are on track. Okay, so which gland is divided into two functional units? The thyroid, although it does have follicles and parafollicular, they're not separate. They're all intermixed. Pineal is all the same throughout. Thalamus is not even a gland we're talking about. Hypothalamus is the same throughout. Pituitary, the anterior is endocrine. It makes hormones. The posterior is neural. The other gland that has that as well would be your adrenal gland, the cortex versus the adrenal medulla. Okay, which of the following is a true statement? The levels of glucagon and insulin are based on positive feedback system. That's incorrect. This should be negative. Hyperglycemia stimulates the release of glucagon. Hyperglycemia means you have too much sugar, so that would stimulate the release of insulin, not glucagon. Insulin increases glycogenesis, the formation of glycogen. So we're able to store glucose as glycogen in the liver and muscles. And once you basically reach the storage capacity, you're then going to convert and store it as fat. So you'll have lipogenesis as well. That is true. Glucagon stimulates the kidney cells to release glucose into the blood. For D, glucagon stimulates not kidney cells, but liver cells and muscle cells to release glucose into the blood. And then the most important regulator of insulin and glucagon are blood glucose levels, not amino acid levels. Okay, again, which of the following are true? A carbohydrate meal increases insulin secretion. Carbohydrate meal is going to have high sugar. Whenever you have high amounts of sugar, negative feedback loop means we're going to release insulin. A low-carb meal or protein-rich meal would increase glucagon secretion because you're not having the sugar from the diet. A carbohydrate meal would decrease glucagon secretion. Parasympathetic stimulation increases insulin. Parasympathetic, rest and digest. You don't need as much blood sugar in the blood, so that's true. Okay, so that's true. Exercise sympathetic would increase glucagon. Glucagon is antagonistic to insulin. Sympathetic is opposite from parasympathetic, so that's true. So, of course, all of these are true. Now we're going to talk about, again, a few of the other endocrine glands and then some tissues that are actually found in other organs that release hormones. So pineal gland is a primary endocrine gland. It's a component of the epithalamus that sits just behind the thalamus and above the corpora quadrigemina of the brain. It makes a neurohormone called melatonin, which is actually made from serotonin. We do see that the amount of light and dark that a person is exposed to does affect when melatonin is released. So we secrete more melatonin in dark, and light we're going to release less. The main target are going to be tissues which help regulate sleep. So that's going to be the reticular formation. Reticular formation is the system in the brain that helps stimulate the appropriate cortices, basically arousing and keeping the brain alert. So when you're sleeping, of course, the brain's going to be less alert. Thymus is also a primary endocrine gland. It's found within the mediastinum, okay, the center area of the chest, and it is superficial to the heart. This is where T lymphocytes or T cells go to mature. Hormones made here include thymosin and thymopoietin. And these are paracrine, so basically they act on nearby cells, meaning T lymphocytes, increasing their maturation process, which is essential for a healthy immune system. The gonads, for males that would be testes, females would be ovaries, are going to make the main female and male hormones. So that is the endocrine function. However, they also have an exocrine function, which is the production of sex cells or gametes. So, of course, the testes will produce sperm. The females will produce ova or eggs. So the testes make testosterone. The production and secretion of this is regulated by a multi-tiered negative feedback loop. We actually discussed this when we talked about the gonadotropins. Okay, so FSH and LH are considered gonadotropins because they act on the gonads. So if you want an increase in those, you're going to have to tell the anterior pituitary to release those. So you have the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which tells the anterior to release those two hormones. LH helps increase testosterone synthesis, and FSH basically helps that binds testosterone, keeping it in the testes, which therefore is going to aid in the maturation of the sperm. When you have too high amounts of testosterone, you of course are going to stop releasing that stimulating hormone, which will stop triggering cells to make, and it's called the Leydig cells, that are going to make that testosterone. Testosterone is a lipid or fat-based hormone. So it is hydrophobic, so it's going to bind to intracellular receptors. It does have an anabolic effect. Remember, anabolism include reactions that build new molecules. So it's going to stimulate bone growth, increase muscle mass, which is why men do have larger bones and more muscle than females. It also stimulates another hormone to be released in higher concentrations, and that's EPO, or erythropoietin. EPO stimulates red blood cell production, which means tissues also have a more readily supply of oxygen available. It also has androgenic effects, which involve, again, developing or maturing a male. Secondary sex characteristics, which are going to include the deepening of the voice, the increased musculature, starting to get hair on the face and neck regions. Estrogen, and I know a lot of people think only males produce testosterone, only females produce estrogen, okay? But we already talked about the females do produce a little bit of testosterone in the adrenal cortex. Males can produce a little bit of estrogen in the adrenal glands, as we mentioned before. So as we discussed the negative feedback loop with testosterone, the same thing occurs with estrogen. And of course, estrogen is going to make females mature with their secondary sex characteristics. So increased number of adipocytes in the breast, in the hip region, the beginning of the menstrual cycle, which again, of course, makes the female be able to get pregnant and give birth. It also does have other effects on tissues and organs. Bone, actually, estrogen helps increase the bone density, which is one reason why postmenopausal women, it's easier for them to develop osteoporosis. Progesterone is another female hormone that is highest after a woman ovulates. It's also high during pregnancy. Basically, ovulation is when the woman expels the potential egg that could get fertilized. And until the body knows for sure if you're pregnant or not, it's going to make the progesterone to make sure that the inner layer of the uterus is not sloughed off if you potentially could have a zygote there. So if you are pregnant, you want to continue making progesterone to make sure that the woman doesn't miscarry. Progesterone also affects smooth muscle of the body. It basically increases smooth muscle thickness. So the uterus is really going to increase the amount of muscle mass when a lot of progesterone is given. It does affect body temperature. We're not going to get too detailed about either estrogen or progesterone right now because we will get very detailed when we cover the reproductive system. Adipose tissue. Adipose tissue are made of adipocytes, and adipocytes do produce a hormone. It's a protein hormone called leptin. And leptin is, of course, lipid soluble, so it's able to cross the blood-brain barrier where it interacts with the neurons of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the main target for leptin. Leptin makes you feel satisfied, so it prevents you from eating too much. Leptin also is related to how much adipose tissue you have. So the less leptin you have in the body, the more you're going to be prompted to eat. But of course, there's a lot of other things that will promote more food intake: thyroid hormone, growth hormone, glucagon, etc. Leptin, because it makes you feel satisfied, has been researched a lot because people had thought if you could just give people leptin, even if they're not eating, if it binds the receptors in the brain, you still won't feel the need to work. Very unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be very effective, but people do still sell it and try to make money off of it. The heart, we've actually already mentioned. ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide, excuse me, because it is antagonistic to all of the hormones in the Ross system. So remember, the Ross system included renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, and then of course system. Sorry, that doesn't really stand for anything. So ANP is going to be released when basically the heart, the atria are getting stretched too much, which means that blood pressure is too high. So it's going to make smooth muscles relax, causing vasodilation that will help decrease blood pressure. Also, to help decrease blood pressure, we could decrease blood volume. So it's going to increase the amount of sodium ions that we're excreting. And again, water is naturally going to always follow sodium. Of course, both of these, the vasodilation and the natriuresis, as I said, are going to decrease the amount of blood in the body. That specifically is going to be more from the natriuresis, the removal of the sodium and the water. But both doing that and vasodilation together will help lower the blood pressure, which is the goal when you are releasing ANP. So that's the effect of ANP, is to lower blood pressure. So we talk about the opposing effects of atrial natriuretic peptide and angiotensin 2. Remember, angiotensin is actually going to make the body release ADH, which increases water reabsorption in the body. It also is going to increase aldosterone, which increases the amount of sodium we're keeping, which therefore also increases the amount of water. And angiotensin also is a vasoconstrictor. Because if we're wanting to keep water, that means blood pressure is too low. So if we have constriction, that will increase it. The kidneys have a lot to do with several hormones. So EPO is actually made by the kidney cells when there is not enough oxygen in the blood, and actually when blood pressure is low too, but the main thing is when you have decreased oxygen levels. And EPO stimulates the red bone marrow to make more red blood cells, or erythrocytes, which of course, the more red blood cells you have, the more oxygen you can carry to all the cells of your body. Remember, specific cells in the kidney also make renin, which again, this is that Ross system that's going to convert a plasma protein that's always in our blood in an inactive form. Remember, inactive form is ogen, so angiotensinogen, into angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin 1 in the liver then gets converted to 2. And then you have ACE released by the lungs, and that's basically then going to allow you to release aldosterone as well. And of course, all the effects of the Ross system are going to maintain blood pressure by increasing blood pressure. And then vitamin D we make in our skin through sunlight and in the diet. And the kidneys must convert this into an active form, which is what we call calcitriol. Okay, so the kidneys are very vital to endocrine function. Okay, so again, this is just a chart if you feel that's a more effective way to review material. Okay, so a little bit of review from what we just talked about. Male and female gonads are considered reproductive and endocrine organs. That's true. Okay, so don't let the fact that just because you have one organ, it only has to be part of one system. You know, we discussed hypothalamus, for example, pituitary, pineal are part of endocrine and nervous. Obviously, the heart's part of cardiovascular. Pancreas is part of endocrine and digestive. So several organs are that way. Okay, which of the following is true to melatonin? So is melatonin secreted by the pineal gland? That is true. Is it stimulated by sunlight? No, it's stimulated when you're dark. It is a derivative of serotonin, and it has nothing to do with melanin, which is skin color. So yes, E is correct, 1 and 3. Okay, which one of these hormones is not matched with its action? LH does trigger ovulation. That is true. Aldosterone helps increase blood pressure. So that's the false one. Cortisol is released in response to stress by the adrenal cortex, by the middle layer, zona fasciculata, and the inner layer, zona reticularis. Thymosins and thymopoietin stimulate T lymphocytes, and progesterone prepares the uterine lining, making sure that you don't miscarry, slough off the very inner portion, and actually it also stimulates the muscle as well to increase the thickness. So that's true. Okay, the stress response is primarily regulated by the pituitary gland. That is false. Okay, although the pituitary gland does make ACTH, okay, which does stimulate the adrenal cortex, that is not the greatest factor that makes you release cortisol. Stress response, it should be, if it's true, is primarily regulated by the adrenal cortex to make that statement true. Okay, this discussion question I would like to talk about on Monday in class. Okay, we're going to look at a few different examples of how the endocrine system is controlled. So the following events are involved in maintaining the correct fluid amount in our body. So the hormones we're talking about here would be ADH, aldosterone, and ANP. So remember, aldosterone and ADH work together, and ANP is antagonistic. So in normal conditions, meaning the amount of fluid you have in your body is normal, you have low amounts of ADH and aldosterone that are still secreted. They're continually secreted, okay, to make sure that the amount of urine that we're producing is normal. Okay, you don't want to be urinating too much and cause dehydration. However, when we lose the amount of fluid in the body, and we most easily see this in the amount of plasma. Plasma is the fluid portion of blood, which is mainly water. If you lose water, then you're going to have more ions and stuff in the water, so you've increased the solute concentration. When that happens, ADH and aldosterone will be released more, okay, which means you would decrease the urine output, keeping more water in the body and making the water per solute ratio where it should be. Okay, increased plasma volume. So you have too much fluid, not enough solutes. That's when you're going to stop doing ADH and aldosterone and do the hormone that is opposite effects, which is ANP. So that's going to make you urinate more, therefore losing water, and again making the water electrolyte balance equal. Okay, so just the three different viewpoints you can see there. We did talk about if you need to go through and review the hormones for how that's done, this would be a great place to do that. We discussed metabolic homeostasis in great detail before, so this would just be a good one that I would say review on your own. These two, just talked about that. Big picture, this is actually something good to talk about. This is kind of hard for a lot of people. So when you're stressed, hey, what are all the different things that are going to be occurring? Stress could be caused by, external things, personal things in your life, or by exercising. Okay, so when that happens, we do want to increase the amount of secretion that's being done by the adrenal cortex. So the first tier for that, so the hypothalamus is going to secrete corticotropic releasing hormone. Okay, so this is a tropic hormone that uses that hypophyseal portal system between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. It's going to cause it to release we call cortitrophs. We just said that is ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release the different hormones that are produced there. So we will produce aldosterone. Remember, aldosterone is going to increase the amount of sodium in water, so that's going to raise blood pressure, which of course when you're stressed you do have a raise in blood pressure. ACTH also acts on the inner two layers, the fasciculata reticularis, making an increase of cortisol. We talked about the different effects of cortisol on the liver. So remember, whenever you have cortisol, that means that you have to have more glucose going to the blood. So in the liver, we're going to be promoting the breakdown of glycogen, glycolysis, into glucose. And we're also breaking down fats, fatty acids that can be used for fuel molecules and converted into glucose as well. Okay, what we also have going on here, when you're stressed, immediately you're going to trigger the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the hypothalamus is the center for the ANS. So the sympathetic nervous system, you have axons that extend directly from the hypothalamus. There's a different color so you can see that better. Directly from the hypothalamus to the adrenal medulla, causing its secretion and release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Of course, the main one is epinephrine. Epinephrine is going to have, the similar effects on the liver and adipose cells as cortisol does. The sympathetic nervous system is also wanting to increase glucose in the blood, so it's going to trigger the pancreas to release glucagon that will also help raise blood glucose levels, okay, that we see down, all the way down at the bottom. What we also see going on here is that when you're under stress, your body needs to work harder. So that's going to promote tissue growth. So we also need to make growth hormone. So again, we have the first tier is going to be the hypothalamus, makes the growth hormone releasing hormone, which tells the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone, also called somatotropin. And of course, growth hormone has all of the same effects on the liver and the adipose cells as cortisol and epinephrine did. So again, all of these are enhancing that response that we want more glucose into the blood so the body can have more activity.